Welcome to Running Hot, Action Network's motorsports betting podcast. I am your host, Nick Giffen, predictive analyst here at Action Network, and this is the special Indianapolis 500 episode of Running Hot. Sunday marks the 108th running of the Indianapolis 500, the greatest spectacle in racing. 33 drivers will attempt to get their name and face etched in history on the Borg-Warner Trophy by winning the biggest race in the world. Now, normally we have a NASCAR audience here, but for those of you unfamiliar with IndyCar racing, these open wheel cars are quite different from NASCAR stock cars. Indy cars can hit 240 miles per hour at the end of these kilometer-long straightaways, and their speed and design and the current body style lends itself to a race where the draft very much does come into play. However, it's not a pack racing style draft like we see in NASCAR with Daytona or Talladega. Instead, it's like a long train of 33 cars, and drivers need to set up their pass coming off turns 2 or turns 4 down that kilometer long, either front straight or back straight going into turns 1 or 3, set up their pass. So what that means is no lead is safe in the Indy 500. It also means it's pretty hard to use practice times to gauge performance, and that's important because the Indy 500 has more practice time than any race we typically evaluate. There was practice all last week. There was practice this week. There was qualifying sessions. There was an open test back in April. But again, that could be a fool's errand because practice times can be, I don't want to say manipulated, but misleading by a car getting a big draft or a tow, as we call it in open wheel parlance. So you can artificially put up a monster time in practice. So instead, we have to find a different way to evaluate our bets. So I'll be looking mainly at 4 factors. Number 1, of course, is what equipment are you in? Obviously, just like NASCAR, we have bigger teams, better cars, better equipment. You know, your Team Penske's, your Aero McLaren's, your Ganassi's, your Andretti's. Those are the big 4 in IndyCar, your bigger teams there. So that is step number 1. Who has the better equipment? Now, that doesn't mean only the better equipment will win, but it certainly goes a long way. Now, part number 2 of these 4 factors is practice evaluation, but I'm not talking speed. Again, those times, practice speeds can be misleading. When I talk about practice evaluation, I'm talking about watching every single practice session, listening to what the drivers are saying, looking at how these cars are running on track, who has an easier time setting up passes, being able to suck up to the car in front of them, those kinds of things. What are the drivers saying? Are they comfortable with the balance and the handling of their car? Are they uncomfortable? When did they come in to make changes on their car in the practice sessions? Because all those things can tell you a little bit about whether these drivers are happy with their cars or not in race trim. Number 3 will be track history. Of course, if you're great at the Indianapolis 500, that always helps. We see a driver like Santino Ferrucci has always been great at Indy. We should expect him to have another strong race. So certainly track history comes into play. How good are you at Indy? And number 4, how good are you just at other ovals in general? We do have some other ovals on the IndyCar circuit, namely Gateway, or Worldwide Technology Raceway, as it's called, has been the oval of recent years. So we can definitely use some of that as well for some of the younger drivers. You know, they've definitely run at Gateway, maybe at Iowa or a couple other ovals over the years in the lower series. So that could be useful as well. For example, I used that in my Christian Rasmussen 200-1 bet analysis for him to win the Indy 500 that I wrote about on actionnetwork.com last week. Then there's some other kind of intangibles, other factors that I want to discuss because the Indy 500 is a very different beast from all the other IndyCar races, but also from, you know, if you're used to watching NASCAR. So qualifying trim versus race trim, there's going to be a big difference in which cars were good in qualifying and which cars are good in the race. Yes, Team Penske qualified 1, 2, 3. Yes, they should be favored to win the race, but in race trim, they will be a little more susceptible, right? We have the draft, which kind of equalizes things. And, other teams have had different setups that might be a little bit better or about as equal to Team Penske in race trim. So just because they looked really fast in qualifying doesn't mean they're going to be the best in the race. And in fact, if we look at the 12 races in this current era of IndyCar with the DW12 chassis, which started in 2012. There have been 12 Indy 500s, and the pole sitter has won the Indy 500 just once. And a driver starting on the front row, which of course is spots 1, 2, and 3 with our 3-wide start at Indianapolis, has won only 3 out of the 12 times. That's just 25% of the time here. So even though Team Penske should be favored, I think they're overvalued in the market. And we'll talk about that in my turn 1 pick. So that's, another intangible, qual trim versus race trim. Another intangible here is the 2 engine manufacturers. Chevy dominated qualifying. They placed 9 of the top 12 cars in the Fast 12 qualifying. They locked out the front row. They locked out the Fast 6. So Chevy certainly had the better horsepower, better performance ability in qualifying. But Honda in the race is going to make probably better fuel mileage as a result. They have in years past, and I do think Honda again this year will be making better fuel mileage. And that's important because fuel mileage always comes into play at the Indianapolis 500. And it may not be, we're trying to cross the finish line running out of fuel as Alexander Rossi did in 2016, but it may just be we're trying to save enough fuel so that we can go harder on the last stint than the other guys were running around. So if Honda makes better mileage, they can run harder, more full rich on the last stint of the race and potentially pass the Chevys that way. So Honda's fuel mileage, I think, is going to come into play. And I do think Honda is undervalued in the market. Finally, just race strategy. There is always strategy in the Indy 500, whether it's fuel strategy, cautions coming out, when do you pit, when do you stay out? There's a whole bunch of things that'll come into play here. It is a 500-mile race. It's by far the longest race of the year for the Indy 500. And we see all sorts of things happen. We see pit road issues. We see on-track issues, so mechanical. So all of these things could bring out cautions and affect race strategy. So that is my Indianapolis 500 preview. And with all that out of the way, it is time to dive into some bets. I'll ride along with you for a lap around the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. That's 4 turns where I'll give 1 pick per turn before we take the traditional sip of milk in victory lane. So it's time to throw the green flag on the 108th running of the Indianapolis 500 and go 3 wide into turn 1. Okay, as I mentioned, for my turn 1 pick, I do want to talk about Team Penske. They should be favored, and I think the best way to play Team Penske is not to pick them to win the race, and it's not even a bet on them in this race. Instead, I'm going to bet on 2 of their drivers to win the IndyCar championship. So I'm going to take Scott McLaughlin to win the IndyCar championship at 12-1 at BetMGM. I'm going to take Will Power to win the IndyCar championship 9-1 at BetMGM. And what this does, if they really are going to win the Indy 500, it is probably going to come at the expense of Alex Palou. Alex Palou in race trim on Monday struggled. They even made changes to their race car 14 minutes left in the practice session. Major changes. Took it back to the garage. That tells you they're not happy with the race car. And Alex Palou is currently the points leader, currently the heavy favorite to win the championship. So if Team Penske has a great race, instead of betting them 4.5-1 to win the race, let's bet them 9 or 12-1 to win the championship. And the other thing is we're going to have a bunch more ovals coming up in the second half of the IndyCar season. That is going to be big advantage to Team Penske. Team Penske has dominated ovals outside of the Indianapolis 500 in recent years. We think Texas, if we think Gateway, Team Penske has been dominant. And Alex Palou has struggled at ovals. He has not had a finish on these shorter flat ovals better than, I think it's 7th place over the past couple years. So that is going to also hurt Alex Palou's chances to win the championship and help these Penske guys with 2 races at Iowa, 2 races at Milwaukee, and 1 still remaining at Gateway. We also have the oval at Nashville, which was originally supposed to be a road course turning into an oval. Huge advantage to Team Penske here. So let's take these Penske drivers. Now, why am I not taking Joseph Newgarden? Well, he's the 2nd favorite to win the championship, but he's way down there in the championship standings. If we look at the championship standings, right, Alex Palou, number 1. Number 2 is Will Power, who's 12 points back. Number 3, Scott Dixon. Number 4 is Colton Herta. Felix Rosenqvist 5. Then we get to Scott McLaughlin 6. And that's only because he had his finish taken away from him at St. Petersburg, where he ended up on the podium there. So Scott McLaughlin has actually run like a championship contender all year. Joseph Newgarden is all the way down in 17th in the points right now. He only has 61 points. That is 91 points behind Alex Palou. So even a win doesn't help Newgarden as much as it would help McLaughlin or Will Power in the championship standings here. So I like taking Will Power 9-1, Scott McLaughlin 12-1 to win the championship, the IndyCar championship at BetMGM. And that way, if they do win the Indy 500, this bet is off to a great start. So that is turn 1. We're going to go down the short stretch and make the turn into turn 2. Okay, for turn 2, I am going to go with an interesting prop bet here. I'm going to go with the total number of cautions over 4.5. You can get that at minus 130. And again, if we look at this DW12 chassis era, that is the past 12 years. In those 12 Indianapolis 500 races, the number of cautions has been over 4.5 in 10 of the 12 races. So we're already off to a great start here. It's just a line that is too low. And even if we just look at the last 5 years, which I'm cherry picking to make it as bad as possible, this has still cleared in 3 of the last 5 years. So, minus 150 would be fair odds if that were to be the long-term trend. So then we also have to account for the fact that there is rain in the forecast for Sunday, and rain could bring out an extra caution or two. And there's a little quirk with IndyCar that I noticed in the past, and I'm not sure if it still holds true, but I don't really mind either way. All it can do is enhance this bet even further, but if it doesn't, I still like the bet. But I noticed a quirk back when Dario Franchitti in 2007 won the Indianapolis 500 in a rain-shortened race. There was a rain caution earlier in that race on lap 112, from 112 to 113, and then they threw a red flag, and then waited out a long red flag. And then when they restarted the race on lap 114, they counted as a second caution period. So that counted as 2 cautions for one rain event. So if that holds, that'll help this bet even further. Now, if it doesn't hold, I still like this. Any rain event will still help this bet. And we've already gone over 4.5 cautions in 10 out of the 12 years in this DW12 chassis era. So each of the last 2 years had over 4.5 cautions. We had 5 and 6 in 2022 and 2023. So I definitely like over 4.5 cautions as my second bet for the Indianapolis 500 here on Running Hot. So we're going to get a big toe down the backstretch, that kilometer-long backstretch, and head towards turn 3. But before we do, I want to remind you all, Running Hot is presented by BetMGM. Use bonus code ACTION when signing up to get up to $1,500 back in bonus bets if your first bet does not win. For new users in Arizona, Colorado, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, New Jersey, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia, and Wyoming. Bonus code ACTION will give new users in North Carolina $150 in bonus bets for betting just $5. Terms and conditions apply. Must be 21 or older. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Okay, 2 turns down, 2 turns to go around this 2.5-mile Indianapolis 500 oval. We got that nice big toe down the backstretch, and we're going to dive into turn 3. All right, for turn 3 here, I am going to go with the driver that, if you are watching this, I am wearing his shirt, and that is Colton Herta. I'm going to take him at minus 115 in a head-to-head matchup over Alex Palou. So I think Colton Herta will finish better than Alex Palou. And this comes down to the simple fact that Colton Herta looks amazing in practice and qualifying. Especially practice, loves his race car. Loved his race car last year and said that was the best race car he ever had at Indy. And thinks this car could be even better than last year's car. And if we look at where Colton Herta finished last year in the Indianapolis 500, he did only finish 9th, but he had probably a better car than that. That result wasn't quite as flattering. And on the flip side, I mentioned Alex Palou in turn 1. He didn't like his car. They made wholesale changes to that car with 14 minutes left in Monday practice in race trim. So you've got one driver that loves his car. He looks like one of the cars that can pass the easiest in practice. It looks like Colton Herta almost can pass at will when he's trying to make passes in practice. And Alex Palou has struggled to find speed and comfort and balance this week in his car. So I think this is just a spot where, we've got two drivers that are relatively equal in terms of where the market sees them, but one of them loves his car and one of them doesn't. I think we got to go with the one that loves his car. Both of these are in Hondas, so there's no engine advantage or disadvantage here. So I think we absolutely have to take Colton Herta minus 115 over Alex Palou as the turn 3 pick. And you'll be hearing more from me about Colton Herta a little bit later. But that is turn 3. We're going to take that second short shoot into turn 4. Okay, turn 4 here. And this is admittedly very much a homer pick, but I don't make this bet without actually truly believing in it. And I'm going to take my favorite driver, Kyle Kirkwood, to win the Indianapolis 500 at 30-1 at BetMGM. I also like his top 10 at plus 105 at BetMGM. And look, like I said, I am a huge fan of Kyle Kirkwood. So all bias aside, I believe this is a great bet. Just like Colton Herta, Kyle Kirkwood, who is teammate to Colton Herta, likes his race car. He looks great in the draft. He looks great being able to make passes multiple times. I've seen him, run through the train of cars in practice to get from the back to the front. So it looks like, just like Colton Herta, he almost can pass at will. And if we look at Kyle Kirkwood last year, he probably had the race-winning car there at the end. In that second to last fuel stint, he was passing cars left and right. And this is where we talk about the Honda engine advantage. They had better mileage, so he could pit later, so he could run harder. He was passing cars like crazy. They make that final pit stop. He's passing cars like crazy again, and he probably would have passed his way to the front. But Felix Rosenqvist, 2 cars ahead of him, spun out. Kyle Kirkwood had nowhere to go. Rosenqvist clips Kirkwood. Kirkwood flips upside down, and that ends his Indianapolis 500 last year with a car that potentially probably could have won the race. And Kyle Kirkwood is bringing that same, feel car, just like Colton Herta, back. Those two are teammates, and they both looked awesome. And here's the thing. Kyle Kirkwood starts 11th. He probably would have started around 7th, 8th, 9th if he didn't make a mistake on his last lap in qualifying. There's something called the weight jacker in these Indy cars, and the driver can adjust that by pushing a button on his steering wheel or releasing a button. The driver can adjust that, so a piece of the car will actually adjust, and that'll adjust the handling of the car. And you want it set one way down the straightaways for less drag, and you want it set a different way into the corners so that you can get a little bit more downforce, a little bit more turning. And Kirkwood forgot to adjust the weight jacker on his final lap. Instead of having a 232.5 mile an hour lap like he probably could have, he ended up having a 228 mile an hour lap, killing his lap because he had to lift in one of the turns there. So Kirkwood probably should be starting even better than his 11th place starting position, which is already the best starting position of his career, right? And if we look last year, Joseph Newgarden won from the 17th starting position. And in 6 out of the 12 races in the DW12 chassis era, a driver has won starting outside the top 10. So half the races in this current type of car have been won from drivers starting outside the top 10. So Kirkwood has his best career starting spot, had a car that could have won the race last year, looks great in practice and qualifying. His teammate is at the longest I've seen 15-1 to win, and he's 30-1 to win, and they should be relatively similar in performance. So I'm going to take Kyle Kirkwood 30-1 to win, plus 105 for a top 10, both of those at BetMGM for my turn 4 pick. So there's only one thing left to do. We have crossed the yard of bricks. We are going to kiss the bricks, and we're going to drive into victory lane, have that nice sip of the winner's milk, and make our victory lane pick. And for me, I am, as I told you, going back to Colton Herta. I like Colton Herta to win this race at 15-1 odds. Now, Colton Herta should not be the race favorite. Like I mentioned, Team Penske rightly should be the race favorite. If I were to pick a car to win the race, I would probably pick Scott McLaughlin, or maybe I would pick Will Power or Joseph Newgarden. They should rightly be the favorites. But in terms of value, I think Colton Herta still provides some of the best value in the market at 15-1. We mentioned it. He can pass. He loves his car. He looks great. Everybody is gushing over Colton Herta and how good he looks. If you want to bet him for a top Honda, I think that's great as well. He was earlier in the week before final practice here. He was longer odds at top Honda. Now I think he's only plus 350. So I don't mind that, but I'd rather just, if he's going to be top Honda, take him 15-1 to win. So Colton Herta, 15-1 is my victory lane pick for the Indianapolis 500. He said, again, last year was the best car he's ever had, and this year it could be even better. So that is going to do it for the special Indianapolis 500 episode of Running Hot, Action Network's Motorsports Betting Podcast. Make sure to also catch our Coca-Cola 600 episode of Running Hot, where my co-host Stephen Young of Roto Grinders will be joining me as we give our picks for the Coca-Cola 600. Thanks again for listening, and hopefully we'll see you back for that Coca-Cola 600 episode of Running Hot from Action Network.